Buenas tardes, bienvenidas, bienvenidos.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the 37th Regional Seminar on Fiscal Policy organized by ECLAC. We'll begin with the inauguration, which involves the participation of the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, José Manuel Salazar Ciriñas, and of Luis Mateos Paramio, Business Officer ad interim of the Embassy of Spain and Chile, and Javiera Martinez, Director of the Budget of the Ministry of Finance of Chile. I'd like to offer, first of all, the floor to José Manuel Salazar Ciriñas, Executive Secretary of ECLAC. Thank you very much, Noel. Dear Luis Mateos Paramio, Business Officer ad interim of the Embassy of Spain and Chile. Dear Javiera Martinez, Budget Director of the Ministry of Finance of Chile, dear ministers, vice ministers, and finance authorities of countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, dear representatives of international entities, development banks, specialists, academia, civil society, colleagues from ECLAC, and representatives of the UN system. May you all be very warmly welcome to this, to ECLAC. And I would like to express my gratitude to finance authorities present here and also to representatives of international entities, academia, research centers, civil society, and the private sector. Thanks for your support and participation. We're commemorating 37 years of this seminar. That makes it a regional reference point for a dialogue on fiscal and macroeconomic challenges that we face. This seminar is a clear example of the role played by ECLAC and the UN system in providing the region with a meeting point and a place to exchange ideas between different stakeholders involved in public affairs. We are aware that each country has its own specificities, but we also know that there are common problems. With present-day changes in globalization and geopolitics, and also in terms of exerting influence on the international cooperation architecture, including the international financial architecture. And thus we can argue that it is more important than ever to compare notes and develop common visions. As from this global perspective, we highlight the importance of producing knowledge, regional knowledge products useful to countries and to society in general, such as the fiscal panorama for Latin America and the Caribbean that we will be presenting in the next session. As from ECLAC, we have insisted upon the fact that Latin America and the Caribbean finds itself within a development crisis characterized by three development traps. So one of low ability to grow and transform, one which involves high inequality, low social mobility, and weak social cohesion, and a third trap of low institutional capabilities and of adequate governance. The first trap of low growth capabilities is one of the causes of the scarce fiscal space that also characterizes most of the countries of the region, in addition to the high levels of debt and the present cost of servicing the debt. The combination between a low ability to grow and the limited fiscal space is a toxic combination in order to face up to the challenges and transformations that are necessary, such as increasing private and public investment, improving productivity, and promoting the social and productive transformations that will enable us to overcome those traps and development gaps that we face. In other words, the limited fiscal space, persistent deficits, the high level of public debt, the more expensive debt. All these conditions conspire against the abilities that our countries have in order to use fiscal policy as a tool for development. In this aspect, there is tremendous injustice imposed upon our region by realities, the realities of the international economy. And I refer to the fact that with few exceptions, Latin American and Caribbean countries have learned the lesson and have done their homework in terms of macroeconomic stability and fiscal discipline over the past 20 years. We had debt data that was fairly healthy, that were fairly healthy before the pandemic, but today we are poised in a situation where the fiscal reality endangers our legitimate development desires, and it's very difficult to have a fiscal space for investments in health, education, infrastructure, productive transformation, That is required in order to boost growth and labor markets, reduce poverty and informality, as well as inequalities. Now, I'm not talking here as from an ideological position about orthodoxies or macroeconomic ideas, but as from a very pragmatic and idea and full of common sense. We suffer from developmental distress. That is what we're suffering from in our countries, as analyzed in a document that we published in 2023. And thus, the possibility of having results in the meeting about the financing for development in Seville is tremendously important. And that is why the international discussion about the reform of the international financial infrastructure is so important. Regrettably, geopolitical realities do not make us very hopeful in terms of the results with the desired level of ambition. However, those results are precisely the ones that countries in the region and countries from throughout the world are seeking, and therefore we should work together for that objective. Let us dwell on the weight of the increase of interest rates. And also domestic markets contributed to the fact that in 2024 payment for the debt increased by 0.5 percentage points of the GDP in some cases compared to the previous year, which reduces the availability of public resources for priority expenditure, enabling the overcoming social gaps and boosting growth. Thus, it becomes increasingly important to promote joint actions in order to expand the fiscal space and gear the use of fiscal tools in a strategic and efficient manner. In this sense, this seminar is an important possibility at a very promising moment because the seminar will deal with fiscal issues that are both a priority and also urgent. A dialogue with international entities that accompany us will provide us with some guidelines about the main fiscal challenges that we face as a region, faced with a context of low growth, high uncertainty, and high levels of indebtedness. We'll talk about we'll launch the taxation statistics document, which is a reference document of taxation comparatives in the region that we have produced together with the OECD and CEPAL. This interinstitutional collaboration evidences the importance of enhancing our institutional capabilities in order to develop regional products that may be useful for all countries in the region. We will also be holding a session on how to benefit from taxation policies in order to reduce inequality and promote environmental sustainability. An issue that is tremendously important and that cannot be absent in this seminar is how to provide a strategic guideline to public expenditure and investment in order to reduce structural gaps. And finally, we'll also deal with the need to mobilize financing to expand the fiscal space. The fourth international conference on financing for development that will be held in Seville, Spain, between June 30th and July the 3rd this year is fundamental to enter into agreements to improve the international financial architecture to make it much more effective in supporting efforts by countries in order to expand their fiscal space and promote social, economic, and environmental investments that are necessary, both private and public. As you can see, we have 2 days of enormous work ahead of us. And this room, Raúl Previch, which is full of people, makes us be very motivated in order to, and we believe that this seminar will be a success. Again, may you all be very welcome to ECLAC, and I wish you a very productive seminar. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Secretario Ejecutivo.
Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now I'd like to offer the floor to Luis Mateos Paramio, Business Officer ad interim of the Embassy of Spain in Chile. Luis, please go ahead. Thank you, Manuel. Dear Executive Secretary of ECLAC, dear Budget Director of Chile, Javiera Martinez, and dear authorities, dear participants, both present here in this room and those connected online. It's a great pleasure for Spain to participate once again in this seminar, in this regional seminar on fiscal policy, that in its 37th version. and at an especially relevant moment. The present world faces crisis and multiple conflicts, and this requires financial resources, sufficient financial resources in order to deal with that. Within this context, the fiscal policy becomes a policy that is necessary in order to make headway with the commitments of the 2030 agenda. A fair fiscal policy which is efficient and inclusive becomes the stepping stone for a development that not only boosts the global economy, but also protecting peace on the planet, and that also promoting society models based on social equality and democracy. Within the context of the triple energy transition, digital and socio-economic models, these challenges are especially true in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And it is essential to reflect upon the role of a fair fiscal tool as a transformative tool and as a pillar for democracy in the region. We all have to promote our own development and deal with this transition, and nobody can do this on their own. International cooperation is undoubtedly a key element in order to tackle these aspects without leaving no region behind. And this international cooperation must also deal with the realities of middle-income countries that not only rely upon traditional aid, but require and demand support in areas such as innovation, technical cooperation, technological transfers, and the strengthening of institutional capabilities. This is especially true in Latin America and the Caribbean. The region faces a multidimensional crisis shaped by climate change, transnational crimes, migration crisis aggravated by democratic regression, poverty, and inequality. The support for the region must go beyond the promotion of investments and must focus on the democratic and social strengthening with solid institutions and an effective rule of law. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the social compact that upholds present-day democracies has been eroded for many years and requires new actions and new commitments in order to promote the new agreements between citizens and the state about rights and duties. Within this framework, it is especially necessary to advance in a fiscal compact that as a fundamental component is transparent in the allocation, efficacy, and efficiency of fiscal resources. And this compact is absolutely fundamental to finance quality public services, reduce inequality, and promote integration and social cohesion. Thus, the concept of fiscal justice focuses on the fact that fiscal pressure and public expenditure must be distributed so that we respect the principles of equality and social responsibility, thus directly contributing to general well-being and the prosperity of society. The consensus has been established by clear lines of actions in order to advance in the improvement of fiscal systems and the promotion of social justice. In this sense, the framework of an advanced cooperation model with the Latin American region, ECID, via the program Democracia, has promoted dialogue and the strengthening of social and political actors. Within the framework of this program and with the intervention strategies that Spanish cooperation has undertaken, accompanying the region for many years now, we are designing an initiative in order to promote fiscal justice in Latin America and the Caribbean in collaboration with the partners that we had already been working with, ECLAC, OECD, Oxfam, and the collaboration OEF, CIAT, and others that focus precisely on strengthening dialogue, on strengthening institutional capabilities, and on boosting both actors and voices that enable the necessary fiscal agreements so that we can face up to present-day challenges. This initiative begins with the conviction that it is only via cooperation and via the coordination within stakeholders will we be able to achieve this improvement, contributing to sustainable development, the reduction of inequalities, and an improvement of transparency as the best way ahead in order to strengthen present-day democracies. Examples of these coordination actions and with the cooperation of, with the support of Spanish cooperation, this event is a unique opportunity for dialogue, exchange, and decision-making on possible roadmaps that should guide the region. And the presence here of different institutions at a national, regional, and multilateral level, such as ECLAC, that acts as hosts, ministers of finance at the Inter-American Development Bank, at the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, officials from fiscal and financial authorities of the region. All these stakeholders guarantee a privileged institutional ecosystem to talk about the new ideas and challenges when it comes to fiscal policies in the region. What is a priority is to intensify coordinated response in order to be more efficient and have greater impact in terms of public policies to improve global governance. And this will enable, within a framework of sustainability, to finance the recovery of economic activity and the transformation to more inclusive and resilient societies. I would finally like to refer to the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development that will be held in a few weeks in Seville, that the Executive Secretary also referred to. Well, we will be dealing with the needs, but also with the ways in which we can make headway when it comes to financing for development. A single position to promote debate on fiscal policy and taxation issues. The first draft speaks about the mobilization of national public resources, introduces aspects related to the improvement of fiscal transparency, the alignment of fiscal systems with sustainable development, the capacity building, and the subnational financing that will enable us to focus the debate on progressive and equitable taxation systems, the struggle against tax elusion and evasion, which is important to strengthen the fiscal capability of countries with a fiscal policy as a tool for sustainable development, only promoting the debate and reflection around these issues and on how to guide our efforts towards a fiscal policy that is much more progressive, transparent, and effective, with a strong dimension of social justice and sustainability. Will we be able, via international cooperation, to strengthen national and subnational capabilities? In summary, then, to talk about fiscal policy is to talk about justice, about sustainability and sovereignty. That is why this debate is so relevant here, and above all, in the financing summit that will be held in Seville. What is at stake is not only how to obtain resources, but the future and but the financial and social future of countries and how they can generate sufficient trust in their institutions and fiscal policies in order to make the region attractive for investments and other financial flows. I thank everyone, and I wish you the best discussion and exchanges during this event. I thank ECLAC especially for continuing to promote dialogue and coordination around these major issues, always supported by their magnificent technical reports. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Luis. Y le doy la palabra ahora a Javiera Martínez.
I'd like to offer the floor now to Javiera Martínez. She is the head of budgets at DIPRES, Ministry of Finance. Thank you all. I'd like to welcome you to the 37th Regional Seminar on Public and Fiscal Policy. As we know, and as we have heard from the previous speakers, this is a very relevant dialogue space and collaboration space, most of all among countries in Latin America, the Caribbean. I'd like to especially thank the engagement of the authorities of the ministries of finance of the different countries of the region, of international organizations, and all those who are joining us in this joint effort to rethink and to strengthen our fiscal policies. I'd like to thank the hosts, ECLAC, historical pillar, key in the development of policies in Latin American economies that have tried to face reality in each one of our countries in collaboration, and also in a joint development of the diagnostics. Now, into the topic at hand, the fiscal context of our region in 2024 was featured structural challenges that cannot be ignored. And as we heard from the previous speaker, we face a more uncertain global context of moderate or low growth that also entails significant volatility. On the other hand, we have historical gaps that are expressed in the high levels of inequality, social mobility that is restricted, low productivity, all of which has been worsened after the COVID pandemic in 2019. All of that in a scenario of fiscal space that we know is quite limited. I'm the budget director, so I experience it every day with persistent deficit and debt levels that, although in some countries has been contained or reduced in most of cases. We also see increases, which significantly restricts the state's capability to answer, to respond to the urgent needs of our societies. Precisely because of these topics, this seminar is so relevant and it's so important, specifically these days. We'd like to uh, emphasize also on the role of fiscal policy in this new post-COVID cycle, a policy that needs to be active, efficient, and transformative, as we heard in the previous remarks, not only allowing for macroeconomic stability, but also to guide the efforts towards a more productive and sustainable development. The challenges faced by ministers of finance in this uncertain scenario is how to adapt our fiscal strategies to protect the most vulnerable populations without compromising the long-term sustainability. Tax policy and its potential as a tool to face inequality and at the same time promoting environmental sustainability here in the fiscal panorama text has a remarkable space of discussion. Also, uh, public expenditure as levers to close structural gaps. We know, and experience of Chile also tells us that when public investment is well directed and executed efficiently, it has the potential of making economy more dynamic in our different regions, creating jobs, improving basic services, and also strengthening social fabric. And finally, with an emphasis also on the importance of finding financing, sustainable financing strategies. Um, Latin America and the Caribbean need effective multilateral cooperation and financial infrastructure that supports efforts towards development. There's still lots of creativity to be applied in this current scenario. Uh, just in closing, I'd like to say that how we have been working in the Ministry of Finance during this administration, looking at fiscal policy not only as a technical tool, but as a specific expression of the country's priorities in the way in which we see how we translate our commitments with inclusion, sustainability, equality, and well-being. That's why we have been interested in labeling public expenditure in terms of gender and climate change to be able to assess how we make progress in those aspects. And that's why I believe these spaces are so relevant because they allow us to share lessons and to build collective solutions. Chile, as a host country and very happy to have you here, confirms its commitment with an inclusive and transformative public fiscal policy. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for attending, hoping we have a fruitful work session with ideas that will inspire us all. And so that we all have lots of homework to do when going back to each one of our ministries. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you, Director. And we'll start with session number one, which is the panel with finance ministries. We're going to have the presentation of the fiscal panorama of Latin America, the Caribbean 2025, delivered by the Executive Secretary of ECLAC. So you have the floor, Mr. Jose Manuel Salazar. Thank you, Noel. Uh, well, I see that you all have a copy of the document. As you can see, this year it entails three chapters. The first one is about the trends of public finance. The other one is about the tax incentives to foster, uh, and the third is the macroeconomic effects of public investment. I'm going to introduce the main aspects of these three chapters, but first uh, looking at the regional scenario, and I'm going to close with a few thoughts and analysis about the importance of governance and strengthening institutional capabilities. That, in fact, is the last session of chapter number 3 of macroeconomic effects of public investment in Latin America. As to the diagnostic that we have conducted at ECLAC of the region's situation, is that we see the region suffering from three traps. So, of course, in the data are quite self-explanatory. The growth between 2014 and 2023 was only 0.9% on average per year, which is quite low. The second trap, high inequality in low social mobility and low social cohesion. It's not, of course, those three things are together not by chance, that they're reinforced by the same social mobility, social cohesion, and inequality. And if we would be able to delve into depth, um, low, not very effective governance. So we analyzed these three traps in the position document that we submitted in the 40th period of session that we submitted in Lima, Peru last year, entitled Latin America, the Caribbean, facing the development traps that you can quote in a more detailed version of our diagnostic basic, but we have identified 10 structural gaps that together with this topic of low institutional and governance capabilities define the 11 transformations that we've been discussing and that I'm going to introduce in the next slide. All of this deals with the gaps and traps that are internal, endogenous, if you wish, of the countries. But also, these challenges are exacerbated and made even more complex by an economy and a world geopolitics scenario that have changed significantly and that of course pose a very challenging scenario this year. For about a decade, the increasing geopolitical rivalries have grown because of structural and technological changes of a world economy, which China tripled its weight in the world economy by going from 6% of the world GDP in 2000 to 18% currently. And also where emerging economies are from Asia, including China and India, doubled their weight from 15 points of GDP to 33% of the world GDP, whereas the weight of the United States went from 20 to 15 and Europe went from 22 to 15. And the weight of Latin America was reduced from 9 to 7 between 2012 2023. This change in the productive structure in the world economy is part of what's behind the geopolitical clash that we are experiencing that has been worsened by the tariff-based protectionist response. So all of this is leading to a reconfiguration not only the value chains, but of political investment and commercial alliances. Besides climate change, and extreme phenomena are having important economic costs that are also obstacles to growth. All of that has meant that the IMF has revised the growth perspectives of world economy from 3.3% that was expected in the World Economic Outlook update in January to 2.8 in the World Economic Outlook of April. And as to trade, World Trade Organization is expecting minus 0.02, almost 3 percentage points less than what was expected at the end of 2024. That is to say, it's a revision, downward revision. As tensions escalate, the World Trade Organization estimate that this could be 1.5. And inflation risks have grown with the consequence on the trajectory of the interest rates. In summary, the general scenario is that on the one hand, we need energetic action, including investment, in order to manage transformations to get out of these development traps and to progress towards the SDGs. And on the other, the world context has become more negative and more challenging. This chart shows the 11 transformations that I've just mentioned that are explained in the document that I just mentioned. Very quickly, the first one at the top is the significant productive transformation to achieve more sustainable and inclusive growth. To the right on the chart, there are several transformations associated to social policies to reduce inequality, to increase social mobility, and to improve education and training, strengthening social protection systems and pension systems, and reducing gender inequality. Down below, you see the significant environmental boost to promote sustainability in facing climate change. Then we have digital transformation, progress towards a safe, orderly, and regular migration, and also progress towards a more a higher degree of economic, regional, and world integration. And all this converges into macroeconomics, and specifically as to fiscal policies that are necessary to make all these transformation financially feasible. Of course, adding the mobilization of financial resources, as it was mentioned in the previous remarks during the opening. The key message, though, for the purposes of this fiscal seminar, is that fiscal policy becomes a fundamental tool to facilitate these large transformations. Um, uh, uh, let's go to chapter number 1 about the trends of public that are contained in this fiscal uh, um, public accounts remained stable in 2024. As you can see in this chart, the total expenditure of governments at an average of 21.7% of GDP, whereas the total income remained around 18.6 of the GDP. As a consequence, the overall result of the central government's average at minus 3.1 of GDP vis-a-vis minus 3.2. In this way, we resumed levels prior to COVID-19. This long this gap requires significant financing and is a significant source of vulnerability, especially in contexts with high interest rates. On the other hand, the primary result was is at minus 0.3 of GDP, minus 0.04 of 2023. Although the primary deficit remains on average close to balance or equilibrium, it does not contribute to, because in its evolution, it still the interest rate predominates over economic growth. As to the three first columns of this left chart, in 2024, public revenue in Latin America achieved 18.6 of GDP, just like in 2023. After the contraction that happened in 2022, a slight recovery of tax revenues because of a slight recovery of economic activity. However, the tax performance responded to several factors that are not necessarily connected to economic growth, such as the changes in tax regulations, other resources, capital or donations were down by 2.6 because of the drop in prices of the main raw materials that the region is exporting. We can also see how total revenue as a percentage of GDP are higher in South America by 2 percentage points compared to Central America, Mexico, and Dominican Republic. As to public expenses of the central government, it remained relatively stable in 2024, achieving 21.7% of GDP compared to 21.8% in 2023. However, this stability has significant costs. The capital expense this means that public investment is one of the largest fiscal adjustment policies when countries restrict growth of primary as a percentage of GDP since 2022. By December 2024, the average of public debt from 16 countries in Latin America reached 51.2, the last column, a reduction of 3.9 percentage points compared to the closure of 2023. So in spite of the strong increase of the debt was stabilized up by going from 56.3% of the GDP in 2020 to 51.2 in 2024. But this level is historically high, still above 50% of GDP, which is very similar to the ones observed in 2002 and 2013. That is to say, a little bit more. This level of public debt express the need for financing in the countries in the region. In the Caribbean, the combination of 29.1% of GDP, especially of the capital, and lower revenue of 26.7% of GDP caused an increased deficit in 2024 of minus 1.6% of GDP to minus 2.3%. In the chart, you can see that these are levels that are deficits, levels that are similar to the ones before COVID, although the expansion of the global deficit in 2024 compared to 23 associated largely to larger expenses for reconstruction after natural disasters. The primary result remained in a superávit at 0.7 of GDP. That's what you see there. Several countries are still implementing fiscal consolidation plans to safeguard the sustainability of the public debt, to reduce their actual current debt. Primary superávits that are significant is one of the key objectives in these plans in the countries in the Caribbean in 2024. These superávits were higher than 5 percentage points of the GDP in Barbados and Jamaica, but this level of fiscal effort means that the countries are forced to contain public investment and social expenditure. And in this sense, the international debate about mechanisms devoted to mobilizing resources for development, such as the one that will take place during the 4th conference that we mentioned in Seville about development, is quite important.
Los ingresos totales disminuyeron en el 24 de 21.8 del PIB, con resultado de una disminución significativa de ingresos en los países exportadores de recursos naturales del Caribe.
In the Caribbean income because of a drop in the international prices of energy products. With regard to the service exporters, primarily tourism, the tax revenue maintained the trend in the past. Thankfully, there was a greater tax collection, and the tourism industry bounced back. Regarding public spending, there was a slight increase in 2024 with regard to 2023. This was primarily associated with a significant dynamism of capital expenses, also related to recovery efforts related to Beryl hurricane, which affected the countries primarily in June or July of last year. It's interesting to note how the capital expenses in the Caribbean are twice that of the average capital expenses in terms of the GDP in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this that there has been a significant reconstruction effort that obviously this is explained primarily by that. This is quite frequent. And also, we know that in the Caribbean, you can distinguish two groups of countries, those that export services and those that primarily export natural resources. With regard to the first group, there were greater subsidies and transfers as part of the response to the hurricane. And with regard to the natural resource exporters, those sources of income dropped. Let's continue with the Caribbean. The central government average public debt dropped by 68.4 points. GDP, 68.4 percentage points of the GDP. And also, there were significant differences with regard to 2020 during the pandemic. Now, this is still 17 points greater than GDP points greater than the rest of the LAC countries. 5 Caribbean countries have significant debt, and the debt is primarily due to economic growth. Doing away with the debt is due to economic growth. In absolute terms, public debt level remained relatively stable. Of the 13 countries analyzed, we observed an observation in the drop of the debt level in 12. In conclusion, with regard to debt, we can say that although in Latin America and in the Caribbean, public debt to the central government has dropped with regard to the GDP during the 2020 pandemic year, in most of the cases, it continues to be significantly higher than an acceptable threshold regarding sustainability, because it constitutes a source of macroeconomic vulnerability that is worsened by the current conditions of the international financial context. And these conclusions are reinforced further when we look at the amount of the payment of interest on the debt, country by country, in terms of a GDP percentage. As you can see on the screen, the range goes from 0.4% of the GDP for Guyana all the way up to 6.6 percentage points of the GDP for Barbados. You can see average of 2.9 for Latin America and 3.0 for the Caribbean. Very similar. 6 countries paid more than 4% of the GDP on interest in 2024, and 7 paid between 3 to 4% of the GDP. El Salvador, Mexico, Trinidad and Tobago, Dominican Republic, and others. Another 7 countries paid between 2 to 3 percentage points of the GDP: Honduras, Suriname, Uruguay, Belize, Antigua, Barbuda, and Paraguay, and only 8 countries paid 1.6% or less: Guatemala, Peru, Argentina, Nicaragua, Grenada, Chile, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Guyana. This shows that the paying the interest on public debt has an impact on public spending, and this increase in this has an impact on fiscal coffers. Also brings about the deterioration of financial markets. We saw that given deterioration of the financial markets, we have seen increased interest rates, contrary to the downward trend that was underway. And then there's also local contexts, and this has led to a drop in credit ratings. All of this has an impact on paying interest, specifically those countries that have debt in a foreign currency and a variable interest rate. Also, there are costs associated with the new emissions that face higher financial costs. Most of the quantity of resources earmarked for paying interest have brought about or do have opportunity costs and have generated evident restrictions for development in 3 sectors, as you can see here. This refers to payment of interest by central governments from 2012 and 2023. This refers to 23 countries in Latin America. Now, the percentage went from 45 to 70% for education, from 61 to 86% for health, and 52 to 57 for social protection. In other words, from 2012 to 2023, the payment spent for covering the debt increased significantly. As ECLAC has say, and as we pointed out in a document on this in 2023, this is developmental distress, not just distress. And this refers to the behavior of the average of 23 countries. When we no longer focus on the average, and we focus on individual countries, one can see that in some cases, interest payments are the same, if not higher, than the budget earmarked for education, health, and social protection. At ECLAC, we believe that this concept of developmental distress should be systematically included under analyses and methodologies applied to debt sustainability. As I mentioned, one of the main adjustment variables has been cuts in capital spending, and this is seen clearly in this graph, which refers to, in red, interest payments, and gray, the acquisition of fixed capital assets. This is not a new pattern, rather it's historically present throughout the region. When you see that increase in debt service, specifically interest payment, it makes it necessary to have more resources for sustainability. As far as, and in the end, this also results in investment cuts and social spending cuts. So there are concerns with regard to the sustainability of the public debt, and so fiscal consolidation in Latin America and the Caribbean has resulted in contraction of primary expenses, primarily capital expenses, and this has led to the stoppage of infrastructure projects and restrictions with regard to machinery purchases. The pandemic worsened this trend because the countries set out packages, unprecedented support packages, And then there was the emergency funds provided by international financing institutions. Again, this was exacerbated by the high public debt in the region. Given the makeup of the debt in several countries, most of the public debt is issued in foreign currencies, and held by non-residents. So I have been quite quick with regard to a summary regarding the trend of public finances. That's chapter 1. Now let me briefly refer to some of the main aspects of chapters 2 and 3, which focus on two aspects related to how fiscal policy may provoke investment. The main messages and arguments are that an active fiscal policy focused on investment is essential for bringing about the structural changes that we have called indispensable. And the persistent investment deficit has weakened the drivers of growth and development in the region, thereby limiting the reduction of social and regional gaps within countries. Therefore, boosting public and private investment should be a priority for the region. And this calls for combining productive development policies and fiscal policies. The fiscal outlook for 2025 provides evidence and proposed guidelines with regard to this. Chapter 2, for example, refers to tax incentives for environmental aspects. In Chapter 3, using public investment as a generator of growth, employment, and productivity as a fiscal multiplier. As I explained early on, ECLAC has been insisting upon the need to have a new generation of production development policies to make the transition more dynamic. We don't call these industrial policies, but rather production development policies for a variety of different reasons that I don't have time to explain in detail. I would just like to mention that there is a key reason, and that is that the ontological revolution has changed things. If the classic mindsets of development thought that industrialization was the key component of growth, and they were right, because the industrial sector was the only one that had high economies of scales, supply chains moving on frontwards and backwards. Today, these characteristics are also held by a series of modern service sectors, such as modern agricultural. Modern services have so many economies of scales that it brings about an issue of monopolies and competition. And that's why we think it's more appropriate to talk about production development policies. And we must not forget the major small detail, and that thanks to the robotization, some countries have grown great with regard to industrialization, but growth and employment is less than previous decades. We know that factories have many robots and very few humans. It's also important to clarify something key, that the new approach that we believe in is having governance and cooperation systems involving key players going forward, not one that involves subsidies and, of course, not tariffs going forward. And again, I am providing you with a very quick view and gloss over of these major debates, but we recommend scaling up production development policies, focusing on the dynamic sectors, such as the ones that are on the screen, under cluster initiatives approach, an approach that, if forward thinking, would involve transparency and cooperation. Now, we see that this is a portfolio of driving sectors as proposed by ECLAC, but there's a warning here. It's not about having a closed list. This is an example, and each territory and region should define their own priority driving sectors. The message here is that it's important to separate ourselves from this old debate of talking about picking winners, and let's not be shy, and let's focus on a series of sectors that are key in order to drive the production sector transformation. There are sectoral transformation agendas, and there's a critical mass of sectors driving this. So the role of fiscal policy is key in this task, and not under the approach of having high levels of sector subsidies, but rather earmarking funds for training, HR training, infrastructure, and other areas, and doing this in a cross-cutting fashion, including innovation, infrastructure, HR, and specifically in those driving sectors. Now, in different fashions, some countries in Latin America have done this successfully. For example, Argentina, the agricultural sector, Mexico in the automotive industry, airspace, Costa Rica, medical devices, Dominican Republic, etc., so on and so forth. At ECLAC, a year ago, we launched a platform regarding cluster initiatives and other production development initiatives, and there are more than 300 cluster initiatives on the inventory geolocalized in 17 countries that we are actually using to train a strong community of practitioners in this matter. Now, of course, this is important in the world of free trade, and it's even more strategic in this new geopolitical order where dialogue is crucial, dialogue regarding strategic sectors, where the region has single unique resources such as biodiversity, water, minerals, etc., many others that are listed on the screen. Several countries use tax incentives to steer investment towards environmental sustainability, but the incentives are not sufficient. There's an entire agenda there, as mentioned during this morning's meeting, relative to what extent incentives are actually effective in terms of use of resources and which ones are more effective and the governance for those incentives. As you know, tax incentives are preferential treatments that generally imply a tax collection waiver for the tax authorities. Among the main incentives are exemptions, deductions, reduced rates, and tax credits. In Chapter 2, Chapter 2 identifies tax incentives in 10 countries in the region with a potential positive impact on dynamic sectors linked to environmental sustainability, underscoring potential incidents. We know that we need to investigate that more, research that more in order to document those driving impacts. In these countries, the incentives identified represent a revenue foregone of less than 0.2% of the GDP or less than 2.4% of the total tax expenditure. Strengthening governance and technical, operational, political, and perspective capacities, what we call the top capacities, is key to making progress in generating evidence on the impacts of these incentives and thus improving their effectiveness as instruments of public policy. Chapter 3 analyzes the macro aspects of public investment. And the issue is that the region is characterized by a low level of public investment. As you can see, according to this graph, we are the one region with the lowest level of fixed capital development. Quite low, 2.1%. It's quite a tragedy. And empirical studies show that increasing this part of public investments could bring about significant dividends with regard to economic production, productivity, and employment. The econometric results shown in this chapter corroborate these predictions. The public investment multiplier of 2.7% in highly efficient countries in terms of public administration has a multiplier effect. This is not guaranteed, though. If you have a level of efficiency that is lower, the multiplier drops to 0.3 or maybe even 0. So there's a significant message here. The development dividend of public investment relies primarily on mechanisms of governance and institutional arrangements. In other words, the countries could significantly increase the impact of their investments by investing in strengthening their institutional capacities, strengthening the capacities that we call top at ECLAC, and doing this would be crucial to fully leverage the transformations that the region needs. The idea is that the public investment capacity to address the anti-cyclical aspects relies significantly on the institutions of a country, the institution's capacity to execute. Countries that are prepared can easily tackle this issue, and they shouldn't limit themselves to large projects. They don't all of them have to be mega projects. They're important, of course. We all know that the larger the project, the longer the cycle and more potential dangers, and smaller projects are just as important, such as improving social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and these may have tangible impacts on employment and on community level revenues. In conclusion, let me summarize the importance of strengthening governance and capacity building, institutional capacity building. This is in line with our third trap assessment that we have defined for the region, and that is the low institutional capacity and governance trap, or complex and ineffective governance trap. And this is not just palliative. There is evidence. There's evidence out there. For example, there are evidence colleagues and Mr. Kaufman from the World Bank have come up with documents and information upholding this. So the success of these major transformations depends on good governance to manage these transformations. And at ECLAC, we have been increasing dialogue and research on how to do this and looking for responses in 4 key areas. What we call, again, the top capacities: technical, operational, political, and perspective capacities. If you say it very quickly, it's you'll see that it's I know I said it very quickly, but it's a strong platform or framework. Also, governance, well-coordinated governance, and then social dialogue schemes in each area, as well as the political economy of transformations, which is how to have coalitions, stronger coalitions than for change versus those that are against change. And then finally, financing. For each area of transformation, we have conducted an exercise to address the top capacities. With regarding fiscal capacity, we have this new chart, for example, regarding technical aspects or techniques for fiscal technology. This includes training, training and developing HR, information, evaluation, accountability systems. And as far as operations, we included aspects such as strengthening progressive taxation, implementing strategies to reduce tax evasion, and centralization of procedures for better access to benefits, taking advantage of advances in ICTs. As far as policies are concerned, we also have a wide variety of techniques, such as broad communication strategies with citizens, dialogue for reaching agreements regarding tax return. That's very complex.
And also coordination between institutions. And in terms of prospective capabilities, we have included issues such as the estimation of the effects of taxation reform projects and future developments in terms of fiscal sustainability. As mentioned in the third chapter, the strengthening of these capabilities is a necessary condition in order to increase the multiplier of public investment in countries of the region. It's not a question simply of having or not having resources, but rather of having or possessing the capabilities. And to conclude, we reiterate that fiscal policy is a key aspect to promote structural transformations. The idea here is not to reiterate that which is obvious, but rather to say that the region is called upon to implement those 11 transformations that we believe are fundamental in different aspects, and without those major transformations, we won't be able to escape from these traps and bridge these development gaps. And therefore, fiscal policy must have a need for transformation as its horizon and include those priorities as far as possible within its public budgets and other instruments, in addition to a greater mobilization of domestic resources in order to make those transformations feasible. And thus we need to point towards a consolidation of progressive taxation systems to improve the management of public expenditure, increase public investment, and implement comprehensive strategies for public financing, issues that have been discussed during the seminars and obviously during PTLAC. And for all this, we need to create social dialogue, ensure transparency in the management of resources, and promote greater effectiveness and coherence of public policies. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, secretario.
Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now we'll offer the floor to comments from authorities of ministries of finance in the region, and this will be a closed session.